Well, good morning. Joseph here, not from the Christmas story. I get that a lot. Joseph from the Old Testament. I'm feeling pretty honored this morning because you're all about to spend the next month and a half or so talking about me. My story, how God took my life from the pit to the palace and all the amazing things he did in between. But before you get started on that, I thought you should maybe hear the story from the source, what actually went down. So I brought my own narrator to tell you all about it. I'll interject when I feel the need to justify myself, obviously. So, narrator, go ahead.
This is the account of the story of Joseph from Genesis chapter 37. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers and the sons of his father's wives. But Joseph reported to his father all the bad things that his brothers were doing.
I'm sorry. If I could interrupt for just a second. Hi again. I feel like this part of the story makes me seem like a tattletale. Well, if you guys knew what my brothers were doing, you'd report back to your father too. Okay, sorry. Carry on.
Jacob loved Joseph more than his other children because Joseph had been born to him in an old age.
See? Not a tattletale. Dad's favorite.
So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe.
Yeah, I'll be honest here. I feel like this is where things really went downhill for me.
But his brothers hated Joseph because his father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't even say one kind word to him.
See?
One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him even more. "Listen to my dream," he said. "We were out in the field, tying up bundles, and suddenly my bundle stood up, and all of your bundles gathered around and bowed before mine."
In hindsight, not the best dream to share with your brothers that already hate you. If I could go back in time, I would probably not choose to share with them that they bowed down to me. I realize now as we're talking all about this out loud that I probably should have kept this particular dream to myself, but anyway, continue.
His brothers responded, "So you think you'll be our king, do you? Do you actually think you'll reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way that he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Seriously? Like really? Listen, I had another dream, you said? The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed before me? Really?"
What? I thought if they realized I had a dream where other things bowed to me, maybe they wouldn't take their bowing so personally?
And this is the beginning of the account of Joseph from Genesis chapter 37.
You know what? I feel like this is enough brotherly love for one day. Maybe we go ahead and call the story right there. These fine people have heard enough of my family dynamics for one Sunday morning. Plus, I feel the need to go connect with my therapist once again for a little bit. So enjoy the message.
Well, thank you, Matt and Anthony. And good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. You know, each year, Pastor Jeff devotes at least one sermon series from an Old Testament figure, about an Old Testament figure. And this year, we are going to begin our new year with a story that I think is so timely and is so important for each of us to know and to learn. And so I want to get us thinking about that by asking you this question. Have you ever paid the price for the dysfunction of somebody else? Now you're probably sitting here thinking, well, Happy New Year to you too, Jeff. Way to hit us right away. But that's an important question because we've had kind of a dysfunctional year. And I think we're all looking forward to turning the page to 2020 or to 2021. And as we do so, if we want to learn more about how God deeply loves us, more about how God can use the difficulties and the dysfunction and the trials in our lives for our growth and for his purposes, then I believe this sermon is for you. This entire series is for you, because over the next several weeks, we are going to cover several themes and topics in Joseph's life. And today, we're going to begin with the question that Joseph must have confronted in his life and in the early part of his story. And it's simply this, and maybe it's a question that you've asked as well. God, if you are in control, which he is, and God, if you love me, which he does, then why is there so much dysfunction in my life? Why have I been hurt by people who were supposed to love me? Like so many Old Testament figures, Joseph's story is written in a narrative form, and here's why that's important to our study. The reason we can't put down a good novel, or the reason that we can't stop binge watching a show on Netflix, is because when we watch narrative, we are drawn into the lives of the characters in that story. And in this series, we're going to see the elements of ourselves through the experiences of Joseph. And likewise, we're going to learn from the choices that he made in response to the challenges that were presented to him. And so here's my invitation this morning as we prepare for these next weeks of study. If you are willing to let this narrative draw you in, I believe that you're going to have a new and better understanding of your life. You're going to have a new and better understanding for the things that you have had to walk through or that you're currently walking through. And you're going to understand that through every trial in your life, there is a path that God is calling you to take based upon from where you've been through. So as we begin with Genesis 37, we're going to learn that Joseph's family is going to be turned upside down, and in large part, it's going to be turned upside down because of the dysfunction in his family. And here's a painful truth and reality. Patterns of sin and grace often run through families, don't they? Put this in your own life. Whether it was a harsh word or words that were said to you early on in life, words that still stay with you today, they still haunt you, they still rattle around in your head. Or maybe there was pain that you experienced because you were betrayed by somebody you loved. You were abandoned by somebody you loved. Or maybe you were abused by someone you loved. Maybe you still long for the approval of a parent or someone in your life that you just never felt. And the dysfunction that has come from them is playing a role in your life every single day. Our problems come as much from our relationships or our broken relationships as they do from the choices that we make in our lives. Another way to say it is this: the things that have been done to you are every much a part of your story as the things that have been done by you. And once we come to a realization of that, we can begin the process of growing and healing and moving forward. And God has a plan through each of those dysfunctions. And this is the situation that Joseph finds himself in as we open up this story in Genesis 37. What happens to him and how he responds to it, and how God ultimately uses the circumstances in Joseph's life for his good and for his purposes. These are the lessons that we learn that will give us hope and that will allow us to let God enter into our lives in our brokenness, in our pain, because he can restore us. And today I want us all to be reminded and encouraged of 3 promises and 4 applications that we can hold on to when life's dysfunction hurts us. Before we do that, though, I want to just walk through some important observations to set up the entire series. I think these are things that are important for us to set some groundwork for the study of Joseph and the application that we're going to put in our lives from it. First of all, Joseph's story is the longest in Genesis. Genesis is the first book of the Old Testament, and there are 8 main characters throughout the book of Genesis whose lives are going to illustrate how faith and relationship with God is going to pull them together. The most important account is of Abraham. But Joseph's story, interestingly enough, equals Abraham's not only in the number of chapters, 14 chapters, but it's actually 25% longer than Abraham's story, and here's why this is significant. There are huge things at stake in the story of Joseph. Yes, the narrative provides lessons for how to respond and cope with difficult circumstances. We're going to walk through that. But this narrative also reveals the central theme of the Bible, the central theme of our faith, and that is this, that God's grace breaks into our lives and it rescues us from our sin and our brokenness. That's the theme that's going to stretch through this entire narrative. It's the theme that stretches through the entire Bible. Secondly, the life of Joseph is the greatest and clearest picture of Jesus Christ as shown and projected in the Old Testament. Arthur Pink, a theologian, researched the lives of Jesus and Joseph. And he studied all of the scripture, and he found 101 parallels between the two. A few critical ones include this. Both Jesus and Joseph were innocent. Both were sent by their fathers to check and see about their brothers. Both were sold as slaves. And like Jesus, Joseph was betrayed and brutalized, and yet, in the end, he forgave and saved the very people who would have him killed. It's going to be an amazing story to walk through together. Thirdly, Joseph experienced the powerful truth of Romans 8:28. Paul wrote these words, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." See, Joseph's story is set in motion because of an attempted murder, a betrayal of his brothers, and in the deceit of all of this, the heartbreak of his father. That's some pretty heavy stuff. Joseph, in the cruelest and most unjust way, is going to find himself literally in a pit. And I'm willing to bet that every one of us at some point in our lives, whether real or figuratively, we have been in a pit as well. And maybe like Joseph, we would want to cry out, "God, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this?" We're going to go through Joseph's story, and we're going to see that God never intended for him to stay in that pit, nor does he intend forever for us to stay in ours. In fact, it may be through our greatest pain and our greatest sufferings that we experience God's greatest purpose for us. We hold on to that truth. Fourthly, Joseph shows us faithfulness to God no matter what. The idea around this is the covenant. And this is predominantly through the Old Testament especially, beginning with Noah and then Abraham. God makes covenants with the people of Israel, his chosen people. And a covenant is where both sides enter into an agreement. God's part of the agreement is this: I am going to bless you. I'm going to make you prosperous. I'm going to make you both prosperous and set you up for posterity down the road. He makes this covenant with Abraham. But his continual covenants with his people includes the trade-off that you will obey me. And so many time after time again, that part of the covenant is broken. And so from Abraham to Isaac to Joseph's father Jacob, and then the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph must have certainly understood the importance and the power of the covenant in the line of his people. He knew the relevance of that to the point where he understood his responsibility in it. And beyond his responsibility to the covenant, he also understood his reliance on God through it. And then number 5, Joseph and his brothers. The story of their lives, the circumstances that are going to bring us through this story are a result of family dysfunction. Joseph is 17 at the beginning of this, and he's living in a house or living a life with 3 stepmothers, 3 mothers in the house, 11 stepbrothers. All of his brothers were and could be brutal and conniving and vengeful. We might say that Joseph's formative years were a combination of Desperate Housewives and The Godfather. All right? There's a lot of dysfunction there. And the story of his father is just as important to his story as well. You see, Jacob grew up desperately seeking the approval of his father, Isaac, because Isaac preferred his brother Esau to him. And so there's that struggle that we see in Jacob that's eventually going to play itself out in the lives of his own sons. Let's take a look at the beginning of this. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. So now we're going to get to see, here's how everything unfolds. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now, in this, the drama that you saw previously, Anthony was talking about how, the report I brought maybe wasn't the best timing to share my dreams and share this report. Actually, bad report in Hebrew means maybe stretching the truth a little bit. I'm not saying this justified everything that happened to Joseph, but Joseph plays a little role in this, and we're going to see why in a moment. Now, Israel loved Joseph. Jacob loved Israel more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and they could not speak a word to him. You see what's going on here? Joseph, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is heaping his favoritism on one son out of the 12. And the natural response within this dynamic is jealousy begins to emerge from the rest of the brothers. Within this family dynamic, we see two sort of kids coming out of this. One, a little bit of entitlement for Joseph. That's why he probably has the courage to share the dreams the way he does, the insensitivity in how he does it. He's a little entitled. And at the same time, the rest of his brothers are resentful. 3 times in the next 5 verses, we're going to see the word hate. Hate, hate. Underneath this family is a hidden brokenness that is building upon jealousy and rage and hate, and that's going to lead to a vengeful action. Joseph has 2 dreams. You saw that in the drama. He shares with his brothers that he sees in these dreams a time when they will be bowing down to him. And somehow he's going to ultimately save them. Now, these dreams are real, and they're true. The approach that Joseph took to communicate them could have been different, but the fact is God has a plan here. So Joseph went after his brothers, we learn in a moment, and he found them near Dothan. Here's where the plot begins to develop. And his brothers saw him in the distance. And before he reached him, they plotted to kill him. And here's what they said: "Here comes the dreamer." They're mocking him. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him, and then we'll see what comes of his dreams." And so they do. They debate and they decide they're not going to kill him, but they're essentially going to leave him for dead. They strip him of this beautiful robe that only he was given. The lavishness that the Father has poured upon Jacob, they have now torn it from him, and they have thrown him in this pit. And as we read and continue to work our way through Genesis 37 and 38, we're going to start to see circumstances that are going to develop, because it's going to be 22 years before the brothers are going to see Joseph again. And in the middle of that time, we're going to see God using circumstances that are going to lead Joseph from the pit to the palace in Egypt. We're going to see him use Joseph to save not only his family, but to save his people from famine. But here's something we have to remember. In the midst of our suffering, in the midst of the difficulty of responding to when bad things happen to us or when hurtful things happen to us, there is a palace ahead, but there's usually a pit in between. There's a lot of suffering between the pit and the palace. And so we need to hold on to these 3 promises that we see in Joseph, because they're promises for us as well. Promise number 1 is this: God makes himself known to the humble who hunger for God. Joseph's in a pit. And when we think about it, there's really 2 kinds of pits, isn't there? There's the one that we fall into because of a choice we make, and so I made a terrible choice and now I'm in a pit. But there are other pits like Joseph's where we're pushed in. We're not supposed to be there. We weren't meant to be here, but somehow circumstances or choices by someone else pushes us into that pit. Those bad relationships, Those times when we're hurt, they put us into a pit. And the only way that you can get out of a pit because of a bad relationship is by developing good, healthy relationships. And the most important relationship you and I always need in our lives is our relationship with Christ, our relationship with Jesus. We're coming off the Christmas season. And in John's gospel, John, who was a disciple of Jesus, who would have seen his ministry, would have seen and heard his teachings, would have been with him when Jesus was on the cross. John writes his gospel in a way to reflect back on his life and experiences having walked with Christ, and this is what he says. To all who received him. And interestingly, in the Greek, when John writes this, he actually takes two words that had never been combined before, the word with faith, pisteuo, and he combines it with a preposition in, because he's trying to explain to us, to help us understand that when we, to all of us who believe in Jesus, we have the right to become a child of God. See, this is very personal. A man who experienced all of Jesus' ministry tells us this: you will have life in his name if you believe in him. You know, Lydia mentioned at the beginning of this morning that we're entering a year where there's probably a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of nervousness, a little bit of uncertainty, and certainly there's been a lot of suffering for a lot of people. We hold on to this promise that our relationship with Christ entitles us and brings us the honor of being a child of God, and that with him we can walk through whatever we face. God makes himself known to us when we humble ourselves to know him. And so let's make sure our relationship with Christ is right and in place. Put ourselves in communities where people will continually encourage us in our walk with Christ. This is a promise that God makes. I'll make myself known to you if you're humble enough to hunger for me. Secondly, we need to remember this. Joseph's in a pit. But the whole time that he's in the pit, God is with him. God is at work around us all the time, no matter what we're walking through. When Joseph came to his brothers, Genesis 37 says, they stripped him of his robe. This would be like stripping or dehiding an animal. That's the violence and the abuse that took place as they were stripping Joseph from his robe. They took him and threw him into a cistern, literally a pit, and the cistern was empty with no water in it. We have attempted murder. We have a slave trading because they're going to sell him off as a slave. And we're going to have a brokenhearted father. And yet through it all, Joseph, we're going to see, lived with hope. He lives with the kind of hope that at the end of this narrative, he can look back and say, what you meant for evil against me, God has meant it for good. Your meaning was to kill me, but God's meaning was that through your sin, I'm actually going to save you. It's amazing what God does, walking through us. Even when we're not sure where things are heading, God is always with us. Which leads us to the last promise. God has a specific purpose that he has designed for you and me to fulfill. We've been in pits before. Joseph was in a pit, but God never intended for him or you or me to stay in the pit. Tim Keller says we have a God who turns all deaths into resurrections, and he has a dream for our future glory. God's plan through these dreams was to save Judea, to save Israel. And this would be completely outside of the way that Joseph or Jacob or any of his brothers would have seen it, because in those times, things were very patriarchal and they are hierarchical. A younger brother would never rise above his older brothers. That's what upset them so much. Not only was he entitled and favored, but he had the audacity to say, I'm actually going to save you, when in fact, he was the younger brother. This is what they couldn't understand. And yet when we look back through the series of events that are going to come in Joseph's life, after he goes from the pit to the relationships that he's going to develop that are going to get him to Egypt and get him in front of the Pharaoh, where he's going to have an opportunity to save his people. All along the way, God is directing his steps. God's redeeming love, and we need to remember this, God's redeeming love is perfectly compatible with the terrible things that happen to us. Joseph was thrown naked into a cistern, the same way that a dead body would be dumped in a shallow grave. The Bible says he cried. He cried out to God. He says, please, God, get me out of here. But Joseph in that moment could not have known the bigger plan. The bigger plan that God had to not only save him and save his family, but save his people. Because there's a famine coming. And if all the details don't line up the way we're going to see them line up, everyone's going to die of starvation. God uses Jacob in his greatest pain and his greatest suffering to actually fulfill his purpose and restore Joseph and his family. These are powerful promises for us to hold on to when we're walking through difficult times, or we're walking through times of betrayal or pain or hurt. It's the hope that we have as we look ahead to this year, knowing that God is with us, knowing that God is preparing for us everything within his purpose. And so knowing all of this, no matter where you are today, and I understand maybe some of you are in a pit right now, or you've emerged from one, or maybe you're heading into one. Things are just not working out. Things are not going well. I want to give us 4 applications from this first part of Joseph's life. Applications that we can use to understand that we can overcome the difficult starts and the difficult situations in our lives as well. Number 1 is this: we need to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Joseph is righteous and steadfast. When you read through chapters 37 through 50, with every circumstance that Joseph has happened to him, he remains righteous and steadfast. He is faithful to God regardless of the circumstances in his life. In the midst of pain and suffering, Joseph continues to do the right thing. And by doing the right thing, we're going to see people actually drawn to him. You know, this whole time, Joseph may have been thinking, I've been sold into slavery. I'm in a foreign country. This makes no sense. But in the middle of all that, what does he do? He simply trusts God. He doesn't complain. He doesn't harbor bitterness. He just begins to serve the people who come into his life faithfully. One of those is a man by the name of Potiphar, who is sort of a general within the army of Pharaoh, and he comes across Potiphar. And because of his steadfastness and because of his character, Potiphar grows to really love him and walk with him. I'm not sure he would have done that had Joseph acted with bitterness or anger or contempt, but because he keeps his eyes focused on God, even in the midst of his suffering, he has an opportunity to draw other people to him. And here's a key thing we have to remember too. We always try to do the right thing, but not all the time when we do the right thing is there an apparent reward. That's truly righteousness. We do things for good simply because we're called to do good, not for the reward. And so many times through this narrative, we're going to see Joseph making choices to do things that are good when clearly there will not be a reward for him. In fact, in times he's going to be punished for it, but he keeps doing good anyway. Secondly, we need to remember this. We have a responsibility. In overcoming difficult starts, we can break the cycle of whatever has happened to us. Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the Holocaust. And he said that the last of all great human freedoms is to choose one's response in any given set of circumstances. And what he means by that is simply this, because he had to live it and he had to experience it. One day his life is just going along. And the next day, his possessions are taken. Over time, his family is taken. Over time, his dignity is taken. And now he's in a concentration camp. He survives it. He writes a book called The Man's Search for Meaning, one of the most important books, I think, that was written in the 20th century. And he accounts for all of the things he experienced. And this is the conclusion that he came to. At the end of the day, regardless of the suffering and the circumstances that are given to me, and none of this was my fault, by the way. This is just what has happened to me. You can take my possessions. You can take my dignity. You take my family, but you will not take my hope. You will not take my spirit. Those are things that I'm going to hold on to. And when we think about that, we can think of this. We think of who we are in Christ. And regardless of the circumstances that happen in our lives, regardless of the pain or the difficulties that someone else may cause to us, we can simply look back and say this: yes, that happened to me, but it's not who I am. I'm a child of God. I've been created out of love, and I have a purpose. That is the type of mentality that we can have to overcome maybe a difficult start or a difficult circumstance that we've had, to give us hope and courage to take the next step out of the pit. Next, and this is important because I've always taken a look, we've been taking a look at this from the eyes of a recipient, something that's happened to us. But we have to be honest, there are times when our dysfunction has hurt other people too, right? This is another important lesson we're going to learn from Joseph. We need to always take the long look with every decision that we make in our lives. There's going to be a scene coming ahead where Potiphar's wife is going to make an advancement toward Joseph. And his dedication to Potiphar is going to leave Joseph thinking through the consequences. If I actually engage in an affair with Potiphar's wife, here are all the different things that are going to happen as a result of that. Maybe if Joseph had been more bitter or frustrated, he may have been in a much more vulnerable position, but because he is steadfast and strong, he is able to deny Potiphar's wife's advances. In fact, I think we need to hold on to this when we come to decisions that we may be confronted with that could have horrific impacts to ourselves or to our families or to those people around us. When Potiphar's wife finally kind of corners him and puts the move on him, if you will, it says in Genesis 39 that Potiphar literally left his coat and he ran. One of the things that we can do if we have cycles of issues within our families is we can break the cycle by simply making better choices, looking ahead to what choices we make and the impacts they have on those who we love. We need to take the long look when it comes to every decision that confronts us. And finally this, God uses trials to purify us and to strengthen our character. You see, Joseph ran from Potiphar, but he wasn't rewarded from that because Potiphar's wife lied to her husband and said that it was Joseph who made the advancement to her, and Joseph was imprisoned for that. Completely unfair. But yet it's in the prison for 2 years where Joseph sees the dream that's going to eventually save Egypt, and it's going to eventually restore his family. Genesis 39 says this, but while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him, and he showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the warden. Even in his times of trial and struggle, injustice, if you will, Joseph's response, his reaction, the choices that he makes in light of the difficulties of his life actually allows him to be a witness of the love and the strength of God to those around him. That's how we can turn the trials and difficulties of our lives, just as Joseph did, into things that will make us wiser and stronger. Which brings us to Jesus. It brings us to what I think every message must point toward, and that is, where is Jesus in all of this, in the foreshadowing and the forecasting of Joseph's life? Peter writes this in 1 Peter 4. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. We're going to learn throughout the entire study of Joseph that God's saving victory happens through sin in suffering, not in spite of it, but through it. There's no detour from suffering when we pick up our cross and follow Jesus. And here's why that's so significant to your life and to mine, especially in these uncertain times. Our God, out of his infinite love for us, sent us his Son to not only save us from our sins, but to do so through the suffering that we experience. As we begin this new year, maybe the first thing you need to do is find that relationship with Christ. Maybe for the first time. Maybe you've had a walk with Christ, but fallen off a little bit. Not quite as connected. And maybe this is the morning that you rededicate yourself to him. Joseph and Jesus point us in this direction. Both were victims of those who would kill them. And yet God, through his power, actually takes the will of the killers and uses Joseph and then Jesus to save the killers from their sins. That's only the amazing power and act of God. Amanda's going to come out, and as she sings, I want her words and her music to minister to you. Where are you at with Christ as we go into 2021? What struggles and trials and sufferings have you endured, and in what ways can you place your faith in a God who's walking with you and who wants to bring you out of that pit to use you and the sufferings that you've experienced for his greater glory and greater good? Here comes Amanda.
If my heart could tell a story, if my life would sing a song, if I have a testimony, if I have anything at all, no one ever cared for me like Jesus. His faithful hand has held me all this way. And when I'm old and gray and all my days are numbered on the earth, let it be known in you alone my joy was found. Oh, my joy, my joy. Let my children tell their children, let this be their memory, that all my treasure was in heaven, and you were everything to me. No one ever cared for me like Jesus. His faithful hand has held me all this way. And when I'm old and gray and all my days are numbered on the earth, let it be known in you alone my joy was found. I found my joy. He's faithful and has held me all this way. And when I'm more than gray, all my days are numbered on the earth, let it be known, in you alone my joy was found.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the message, when we enter into this narrative, there's an opportunity for us to see Joseph's life as a parallel maybe to ours. God has the power to take us from the pit, stays with us through the pit, and actually brings us out of that pit to the point where not only is Joseph leaving that pit stronger, but because of his righteousness, he's actually able to forgive the very people who put him there. That's God. And he wants to work in your life in ways that can help you heal from the dysfunctions that have maybe impacted your life. As you go out and about this week, I pray that each of us can find ways to show that light and hope to a world who desperately needs to see and hear the gospel message. Have a wonderful week, everybody, and Happy New Year.